Chapter 18, which is somewhat surprising. Pollyanna entered school in September. In some ways, school was a surprise to Pollyanna, and Pollyanna, in many ways, was a surprise to school. They were soon on the best of terms, however, and to her Aunt Pollyanna confessed that going to school was living. In spite of her delight in her new work, Pollyanna did not forget her old friends. She could not give them quite so much time now, but she gave them what time she could. John Pendleton of them all was the most dissatisfied. One Saturday he spoke to her about it. "See here, Pollyanna, how would you like to come and live with me?" he asked. "I don't see anything of you nowadays." Pollyanna laughed. "I thought you didn't like to have folks around," she said. "Oh, but that was before you taught me to play that wonderful game of yours. Now I'm glad to be waited on hand and foot," he said, shaking one of his crutches playfully at the little girl. "Oh, but you aren't really glad at all for things. You just say you are," pouted Pollyanna. "You know you don't play the game right ever." The man's face grew very grave. "That's why I want you, little girl, to help me. Will you come?" Pollyanna turned in surprise. "Mr. Pendleton, you don't really mean that." "But I do. I want you. Will you come?" Pollyanna looked distressed. "Why, Mr. Pendleton, you know I can't. I'm Aunt Polly's." Pollyanna could not understand the look that crossed the man's face. His head came up fiercely. "You're no more hers than perhaps she would let you come to me," he finished more gently. "Would you come if she did?" Pollyanna frowned in deep thought. "But Aunt Polly has been so good to me," she said. Again that look crossed the man's face, but this time when he spoke, his voice was low and sad. "Pollyanna, years ago I loved somebody very much. I hoped to bring her to this house. I pictured how happy we'd be together." "Yes," said Pollyanna with sympathy. "But, well, I didn't bring her here. Never mind why. I just didn't, that's all. And ever since then this house has never been a home. It takes a woman's hand and heart, or a child's presence, to make a home, Pollyanna, and I have not had either. Now will you come, my dear?" Pollyanna sprang to her feet. "Mr. Pendleton, you mean that you wish you had had that woman's hand and heart all this time?" "Why, yes, Pollyanna." "I'm so glad," sighed the little girl. "Now you can take us both, and everything will be lovely." "Take you both?" repeated the man. Doubt crossed Pollyanna's face. "Well, of course. Aunt Polly isn't won over yet, but I'm sure she will be if you tell her it was her just as you did to me, and then we'd both come." A look of terror leaped into the man's eyes. "Aunt Polly? Come? Here?" Pollyanna's eyes widened a little. "Would you rather go there?" she asked. "Pollyanna, what are you talking about?" asked the man very gently. "Why, where we're going to live, of course," replied Pollyanna in surprise. "You said it was here that you had wanted Aunt Polly's hand and heart all these years to make a home, and—" A cry came from the man's throat. He raised his hand and began to speak, but the next moment he dropped his hand at his side. "The doctor, sir," said the maid in the doorway. Pollyanna rose at once to leave. John Pendleton turned to her feverishly. "For heaven's sake, say nothing of what I asked you, yet," he begged in a low voice. Pollyanna dimpled into a sunny smile. "Of course not. As if I didn't know you'd rather tell her yourself," she called back merrily. John Pendleton fell back in his chair. "Why, what's up?" demanded the doctor a minute later, his finger on his patient's galloping pulse. "Overdose of tonic," John Pendleton laughed. Chapter 19. Which is more surprising? Sunday mornings Pollyanna usually attended church and Sunday school. Sunday afternoons she frequently went for a walk with Nancy. She planned one for the day after the Saturday visit to Mr. Pendleton. But on the way home from church, Dr. Chilton overtook her in his carriage. "Let me drive you home, Pollyanna," he suggested. "I want to speak to you a minute. I was just driving out to your place to tell you," he went on as Pollyanna settled in his side. "Mr. Pendleton sent a request for you to come to see him this afternoon. He says it's very important." Pollyanna nodded. "Yes, I know. I'll go." The doctor eyed her with some surprise. "I'm not sure I shall let you after all," he declared. "You seemed more upsetting than soothing yesterday, young lady." Pollyanna laughed. "Oh, it wasn't me, truly. It was Aunt Polly." The doctor gave a start. "Your aunt?" he said. "Yes, and it's so exciting and lovely, just like a story. I'm going to tell you," she burst out. "He said not to mention it, but he meant not to mention it to Aunt Polly. Of course he would want to tell her himself instead of having me to do it. Sweethearts." "Sweethearts?" "Yes," nodded Pollyanna. "That's the story part. I didn't know it till Nancy told me. She said that Aunt Polly had a sweetheart years ago and they quarreled. She didn't know who it was at first, but we found out now. It's Mr. Pendleton." The doctor relaxed suddenly. "Oh, I didn't know," he said quietly. Pollyanna hurried on. "Yes, and I'm so glad now. It's come out lovely. Mr. Pendleton asked me to come and live with him, but I wouldn't leave Aunt Polly after she'd been so good to me. And then he told me all about the woman's hand and heart that he used to want, and I found out that he wanted it now. And I was so glad, for if he wants to make up the quarrel, everything will be all right now, and Aunt Polly and I will both go to live there, or else he'll come to live with us. Of course Aunt Polly doesn't know yet, and we haven't got everything settled. So I suppose that is why he wanted to see me this afternoon." There was an odd smile on the doctor's lips. Yes, I can well imagine that Mr. John Pendleton does want to see you, Pollyanna," he nodded as he pulled his horse to the stop before the door. Pollyanna found a very nervous John Pendleton waiting for her that afternoon. "Pollyanna," he began at once, "I've been trying all night to puzzle out what you meant yesterday about me wanting your Aunt Polly's hand and heart here all those years." "What did you mean?" "Why, because you were sweethearts once, and I was so glad you still felt that way now." "Sweethearts? Your Aunt Polly and I?" At the surprise in his voice, Pollyanna opened wide her eyes. "Why, Nancy said you were." The man gave a short laugh. "Indeed. Well, I'm afraid Nancy didn't know." "Then you weren't?" "Never." "Oh, dear. And it was all going so splendidly," sobbed Pollyanna. "I'd have been so glad to come with Aunt Polly." "And you won't now?" the man asked. "Of course not. I'm Aunt Polly's." The man turned now most fiercely. "Before you were hers, Pollyanna, you were your mother's. It was your mother's hand and heart that I wanted years ago. I had not meant to tell you, but perhaps it's better that I do." John Pendleton's face had grown very white. He was speaking with difficulty. "I loved your mother, but she didn't love me. After a time, she went away with your father. I did not know until then how much I cared. For years I have been a cross, unloved old man, though I'm not 60 yet, Pollyanna. Then one day, like one of the prisms that you love so well, you danced into my life. I found out who you were, and I thought I never wanted to see you again. I didn't want to be reminded of your mother. But now I want you always. Pollyanna, won't you come? Now? But Mr. Pendleton, I... there's Aunt Polly. Pollyanna's eyes were blurred with tears. The man made an impatient gesture. Well, what about me? How do you suppose I'm going to be glad about anything without you? Why, if I had you and my own little girl, I'd be glad for anything, and I'd try to make you glad too. All my money should go to make you happy. Pollyanna looked shocked. Why, Mr. Pendleton, as if I'd let you spend it on me. Perhaps anybody with as much money as you have doesn't need me to make you glad about things. You're making other folks so glad giving them things that you just can't help being glad yourself. Why, look at those prisms you gave Miss Snow and me, and the gold piece that you gave Nancy on her birthday, and never mind about all that, interrupted the man. That's all nonsense. It wasn't much, but what there was because of you. You gave those things, not I. You, he repeated, in answer to the shock on her face. And that only goes to prove all the more how I need you, he pleaded once more. If ever I am to play the glad game, Pollyanna, you'll have to come play it with me. Pollyanna's forehead puckered into a frown. Aunt Polly has been so good to me, she began, and the man interrupted her sharply. Of course she's been good to you, but she doesn't want you half as much as I do, he argued. Why, Mr. Pendleton, she's glad Glad, interrupted the man, losing his patience. Miss Polly doesn't know how to be glad for anything. Oh, she does her duty. She's a very dutiful woman. We haven't been the best of friends for the last 20 years, but I know her. She isn't the glad kind, Pollyanna. As for your coming to me, you just ask her and see if she won't let you come. And oh, little girl, I want you so, he finished brokenly. Pollyanna rose with a sigh. All right, I'll ask her, she said. Oh, of course I don't mean that I wouldn't like to live here with you, Mr. Pendleton, but she did not complete her sentence. There was a moment's silence, and then she added, well, anyhow, I'm glad I didn't tell her yesterday when I thought you wanted her to. Mr. Pendleton smiled grimly. Well, yes, Pollyanna, it is just as well that you didn't say it. I didn't, only to the doctor. And he doesn't... The doctor, cried Miss John Pendleton, turning quickly. Not Dr. Chilton. Yes, when he came to tell me you wanted to see me today. Well, of all the... muttered the man, falling back in his chair. What did the doctor say? Pollyanna frowned. Why, I don't remember. Not much, I reckon. Oh, he did say he could well imagine that you wanted to see me. Did he indeed? Answered John Pendleton.